Greetings, friends. Today is Friday, May the 22nd of the year 2026, and if all goes according to plan, this should be playing on the same day that the very first Star Wars movie to hit theaters since 2019. I don't remember what the last movie was, but it's The Mandalorian and Grogu, coming to theaters today, actually. And to celebrate the occasion, I felt it appropriate to my own recreation of the one best thing to come out of Star Wars in the past decade or so. May the Force be with you.
Oh please, it's just a plush toy that occasionally gets mauled by a dog. Get over yourselves, you
checkpoint
dorks. 1992 saw the release of The Empire Strikes Back for the Nintendo Entertainment System, a somewhat loose adaptation of the second film in the Star Wars trilogy. And if you need me to point out which trilogy I'm referring to, then turn the screen off, step out of the room, go outside, touch some grass, and go for a nice long walk off a very high cliff because I don't want to talk to you. In any event, the game was not very good. It had poor gameplay, poor control, rather ambitious digital sound output that's also quite poor, a generally all-around poor game which mitigates the few potentially good ideas the game had going for it. So it would come as no surprise that this game would also grace the original Game Boy a year later, initially published by Capcom and later by Ubisoft in subsequent re-releases. The first Star Wars game on NES also received a similar Game Boy port, and while the NES game was fine, the same could not be set for its portable iteration, which was a virtually unplayable mess. And Empire on Game Boy unfortunately follows the same suit to a disastrous level. Empire Strikes Back puts you in control of Luke Skywalker, who must endure several trials in his quest to become a Jedi and eventually confront Darth Vader, all the while helping his buddies in the Rebellion with their fight against the Empire. You start off with a blaster that can shoot in 8 directions, but can later acquire a lightsaber fairly quickly, and forget about said lightsaber just as fast because the damn thing is bloody useless. You have a super jump ability that can be charged by holding down on the D-pad, but eventually you'll come across force powers you can activate from a menu to give you temporary boosts, such as super jumps, super speed, super shots, and other fun stuff if they worked properly, which they often don't. Now there's a couple points in the game where you'll partake in some horizontal shooter segments, the first being the Battle of Hoth where you're flying a snowspeeder and you have to eliminate all the Imperial walkers from the field using either your blasters, your 3 tow cables, or on foot with your bombs. And yeah, on NES, this was a rare highlight on a game desperately in need of highlights. On Game Boy, however, pure pain. Especially as you're pounding lasers up an AT-AT's ass while Slowdown chugs the whole thing down, making me long for the days of Empire Strikes Back on Atari 2600. Hell, even the flood and television version feels like a step up over this mess. Look, take my advice and don't play this game. But if you have to, use your tow cables on the first couple walkers, ditch the speeder, and kill the rest on foot. It's the quickest, easiest, and honestly less painful route in this Battle of Hoth that's seen better days. And then there's a couple X-Wing levels where you're shooting down cloud cars, TIE fighters, and eventually you're going up against Boba Fett's ship Slave One, which, much like the NES version, explodes. And all together now, where's the kaboom? There was supposed to be an earth-shattering kaboom. So clearly there's no Jedi in Game Boy's future. Oh wait. To its credit, Empire does a fair enough job of transitioning the NES content onto the Game Boy as far as the basic bits are concerned. The massive labyrinthian level design is more or less the same as in the NES original, save for a couple changes here and there, such as the omission of those Gatling chicken walkers, that's a blessing by the way. Larger levels like the second stretch of Dagobah is broken down into smaller chunks, which isn't that big of a deal, but otherwise, if you're familiar enough with the NES game that this is largely based on, then Empire on Game Boy should be old hat since the core gameplay has been retained. Somewhat. On the surface level, it doesn't look too bad, but once you dig a bit deeper, you'll find some glaring issues with Empire on Game Boy. The most notable and potentially game-breaking issue is the overall speed. Empire runs very, very slowly, and that's often the case with a lot of these games that are conversions of titles that originally graced NES, but Empire's slowdown is dreadful and severely impacts the game. As such, a lot of the issues that afflicted the somewhat shoddy NES game have been further shodified here. Control is atrocious, bouncing between slightly delayed and non-functional during the most inopportune times. Luke's jumping prowess is somehow worse here, as even the simplest of leaps feel like calculated risks. And mind you, that's before you take the limited on-screen real estate into account here. And for fuck's sake, do not take a long fall in this game because those are slow as shit and the climb back to higher ground is just as tedious. I mean hell, Luke's fall in the actual movie is quicker than the falls in this game. It's just embarrassing. I mentioned the lightsaber being somewhat useless in this game. A tad overdramatic, I will admit. It works against simple single-hit enemies like stormtroopers and little critters, but nowhere near the absolute world killer that it was on NES Star Wars. Sometimes collision detection in this version can be charitably described as a lottery, and even that's being exceedingly generous. As if you need more words to emphasize how worthless this thing is when it actually matters. Even with a force-boosted lightsaber, boss fights are a bit of a chore, and not in a good way. If you could ignore any unnecessary boss battles, do so, but woe to any boss encounter you actually have to overcome to proceed. And as far as respawning enemies go, well, they don't even wait until you get off the screen to respawn. I mean, wow. So yeah, there are a lot of problems with Empire on Game Boy, and that's on top of the list of problems that plagued the original NES game that this is a port of, which wasn't that good in the first place. Smaller screen means more leaps of faith, which can be problematic with these massive levels where one wrong move could lead to either a lot of backtracking or Left 4 Dead. This, combined with the piss-poor controls, the questionable collision detection, and especially the sluggish gameplay, which can absolutely mess with timing for certain bits and cause unneeded grief, such as the segment in Cloud City where you need R2 to freeze the force field to let you pass, which on NES, oui, ça fonctionne, Steve, whereas on Game Boy, look, it's no secret that when it comes to these Game Boy conversions or adaptations of NES titles, there tends to be lowered expectations in how these play out. The fact is, you're never going to get the same experience between the two platforms, that much is obvious. That said, there will never be a point where lowered expectations and or hardware specifications ever excuse abysmal conversions such as this. Not when you have examples of Game Boy adaptations of NES games that turned out quite nicely, either perfectly serviceable straight conversions, or reinterpretations of the same material made specifically for the platform, some of which we've sampled in the past. And yes, Star Wars on Game Boy? Not a good port of NES Star Wars, but still far better than this mess of an Empire. Even a bad NES game deserves a respectable Game Boy port. Oh, and I'm just gonna throw this out there for the lulz, but Race Drivin', arcade port to Game Boy. A much better port than it has any business being, and that's on top of a severely gimped Super Nintendo port of the same game. Goes to show that sometimes Game Boy is more capable than people give it credit for, which makes stuff like this even more sad. But hey, if you're looking for the slightest glimmer of a positive to be found in this excrement of a video game, the X-Wing segments are okay. They're fairly brief, they're actually easier here than in the NES original due to the slower speed, and for these relatively short periods, you could almost pretend to be playing a somewhat competent shooter before being forced, no pun intended, back to the sad reality that is the rest of the game. Now granted, there's a fairly good chance you won't make it this far because it's fairly late in the game and everything else is just fucking terrible, but it's something to strive for at least. Heavy emphasis on the word least. Also, to its credit, the Game Boy version of Empire Strikes Back does a serviceable job of recreating the NES graphics onto the small monochrome screen, which, to be fair, weren't all that great in the first place, but it's the thought that counts. There are some compromises, of course, reduced resolution resulting in some sprites and visual assets looking a bit off. The character dialogue boxes are now separate screens that fade in and out of gameplay. Cutscenes are now reduced to text intermissions. And obviously, there's a smaller screen resulting in less visibility, making those leaps of faith on NES even more so on Game Boy. But outside of that, the sprites look fairly similar. The stage layouts look fairly decent in monochrome, backgrounds are mostly intact. The animation is somewhat janky, but that's a result of the gameplay. And unlike the NES game, Empire on Game Boy does have music playing in the background during gameplay. Most of the tracks seem to be lifted wholesale from the previous Star Wars game on Game Boy, as in the exact same tracks playing it the exact same way in the exact same pitch. So hey, on the one hand you have background music in-game, whereas in the NES version you only had sporadic bits of music playing every so often. But on the other hand, it's music from a previous game that doesn't quite fit the material. But to be fair, you also have Empire jingles here and there, few and far between, and of course the Game Boy port lacks the digitized sound of the NES version, which is where you had rough-sounding voice bites or sound effects. It wouldn't have made the game any better, but it was something noteworthy at least. Overall, if you could forgive the pun, the Empire struck out on Game Boy. Whatever flaws and faults that plagued the NES original have been magnified further and is compounded with a brand new set of flaws and faults that practically cripple the gameplay. And Game Boy could do better. It has done better. But then again, it's one of those cases where if someone were to ask that classic, utterly moronic, well it's Game Boy, what were you expecting derp? My answer would be about the same as what I got with Star Wars on Game Boy. And Empire couldn't even clear that subterrestrial goal line beneath the proverbial Sarlacc pit. No witty outro, not even worth it. Don't bother.